February, March, based on the state, our moratorium, where we've pushed off being able to evict people during the pandemic. So there is a lot of talk in the state right now of prolonging that moratorium and looking at legislation to address this issue. And I just want to lift that up amongst this group, as this has to be one of our top priorities right now, to make sure that the million people in California do not then fall into homelessness, because it is a lot more expensive than $5,400 to get somebody into housing once they have fallen into homelessness. And I really do call attention to this particular study because it brings to light the fact that nationally there's about 40 to 50 million people who are behind in their rent. So if you want to put this in the context of the foreclosure crisis of 2008 and 2009, nationally 3.8 million people lost their homes. And I remember that crisis well. I'm sure all of you do. That was a significant impact on families and on seniors and on many, many people. And that was 3.8 million versus the figures right now are 40 to 50 million of folks who are behind in their rent. I'm not talking about folks who are also, or in separate category, behind on their mortgage. And so both mortgage relief and rent relief has to be at the top of our state and national leaders' minds. And I know that's what is both in Congresswoman Waters' bill and also in bills that are being talked about right now in our state legislature. But I want to make sure this group is aware how critical that is, because the figures dwarf anything we saw in the Great Recession. So that's an overview of the problem. Let's talk a little bit about some myth busting, because again, Carmen prepped me with some really great thoughts around, what some people sort of maybe sort of think about. So one thing I like to talk about is just, I have a brother who's severely mentally ill and has experienced homelessness in Los Angeles County on and off for about 20 years. He is at this exact moment currently and stably housed. And I am, thrilled that he's doing okay at this moment. What I do want to lift up is that severe mental illness it's the same as, the percentage of folks in our community that might have heart problems or, diabetes. And so in general, we just need to approach it on a more fact-based, pattern of saying, okay, we need a certain percentage of our housing accessible to experiencing mental illness. And over the last 10 to 20 years, we've really lost that the business owner calling because they don't know what to do, because they have no experience with someone who's experiencing mental health issues and homelessness at the same time. They don't know how to de-escalate the situation. And then we run into so many other problems. So I want to, again, go back to my point, which is that housing is a piece of our infrastructure. And if we don't constantly demand that and think about it in a fact-based way, we're going to wind up with the challenge of people experiencing mental health crisis and homelessness at the same time. The other myth that, or sort of interesting fact I wanted to talk a little bit about is, housing is always it's a cost that's always kind of a percentage of your income. And housing costs are different in different places. So if I was living in Detroit, housing is far less expensive than it is here. If I'm living in San Francisco, housing is equally expensive. But the difference is in San Francisco, average incomes are $30,000 more per person. So if you're looking at something, I'm going to try to be careful about not using too many, initials, but if you're thinking about something called area median income, which is how most housing policy is derived, AMI, area median income in Los Angeles is quite low. We actually have large populations of people just on the verge of poverty or in poverty, similar to some of the inland empire counties and honestly the agricultural beltway in California. We're very different than the San Francisco Bay Area, where their average median income is $30,000 more per household. And so because of that, there are often times when housing policies are put into place that actually price out people in Los Angeles. So for example, I spent years with the LA LGBT Center to help them open a master campus and this beautiful senior housing. And 98 units are about to open. And as we started to open the lottery for seniors who had applied to live in this housing, and we're looking at their incomes, this is affordable housing, and you have to have a cap on your income to be eligible for this type of housing. The problem we have is not that people are making too much money. It's actually that everyone in the lottery is making too little. That's shocking. So you win the lottery to get this low income housing, and then the portion of rent that you're going to be responsible for is actually too much for you to pay, because our area median income is so much lower than other major cities. So if our housing prices were lower, it wouldn't be as big of a hit to us, and it wouldn't be as hard to finance these projects. But we have both high cost housing and low area median income. And that gap makes it very difficult in the county to build and finance very low income housing. So I just wanted to lift that up as another kind of myth busting. What could really, really help with that, and I'm going to kind of switch into some of the promising things ahead, is Congresswoman Maxine Waters' bill. What her bill does is, in Los Angeles, 1 in 8 people eligible for housing subsidy, federal housing subsidy, which would be a voucher, 1 in 8 people get it. Nationally, 1 in 4 people get it. But in Los Angeles, 1 in 8 people get it. And her bill would drastically increase, both nationally and locally, access to these housing vouchers, attempting to make it so if you're eligible, you have access to it. Because that stat should be 1 for 1. If I'm eligible for federal subsidy for a housing voucher, I should be able to get it. But in Los Angeles County, again, only 1 in 8 people who are eligible for it get it. That stat alone, for me, really demonstrates why we have 66,000 people who are experiencing homelessness on any given night. Because if we already know that people are eligible for federal relief and they don't have access to it, then we know that that barrier alone is preventing the financing of new housing, because we can use those vouchers to finance housing. And it's also preventing us from placing someone from housing into a unit. So I do think Maxine Waters' bill is incredibly promising. And overall housing policy that President Biden and Vice President Harris have been talking about is very promising. But in general, again, it's only going to pass in the Senate and Congress if all of us continue to lift this up as one of our priorities and one of our top issues. And while, Congresswoman Waters is exactly right that we need the approach as if there had been an earthquake and the federal government would come in with thousands and thousands of vouchers in their hands and would place people into housing. We need that approach. And we need folks, to be like, Council Member Jan Perry was and say, I'm just fed up. But to do that, we need all of us saying that we are not going to tolerate the current status quo of folks falling into homelessness. The other sort of promising thing or myth busting thing ahead that I wanted to talk about is just a piece of this that is around structural racism. So we in Los Angeles County experienced redlining the same as the rest of the country. And the effects of redlining, which was the practice of insurance companies and other and quite honestly, federal policy. It was the Fannie and Freddie who refused to back mortgages in certain neighborhoods. So it was federal policy that was actually driving this discrimination in terms of access to mortgages and access to insurance. Those policies have long-term lingering effects because they continued, even after they were outlawed, they continued to be embedded in the approach to financing and zoning and construction. And so, for example, Los Angeles was zoned, our city was zoned for 10 million people. We've been down zoned to a little over 3 million, close to 4 million people. The down zoning happened in wealthier areas. The down zoning did not happen in low income areas. And so that disproportionate effect in terms of creating higher property values in certain areas of the city has been a residual effect of what that redlining practice was. And so I also just want to lift up that third crisis that we're being faced with, which is this reckoning around how do we approach these issues with a more equitable lens, and how do we approach zoning, for example, and when thinking about the impact on communities of color. Because when I lift up, the people who are rent burdened right now or are paying or have back rent owed that will come due in February and March, they are a majority women and they are a majority people of color. So I just want to lift that up as well in terms of there is promise. We're recognizing this issue for maybe not the first time, but we're more aware of it. And the policies that are being discussed at the state level around rent relief and mortgage relief have that equity lens. And if all of us continue to demand that, we're going to get further at addressing the issue than we have before. So I also wanted to lift that up. And finally, one thing that's really promising to me and that I'm working on is this issue of governance reform. Again, if housing is infrastructure, then we have to treat it that way. And the way we treat it right now is the homeless services piece rests with LAHSA, with the Homeless Services Agency, and they contract with a lot of service providers and hopefully partner with cities and do what we need to do to try to rapidly rehouse people. But that's one piece of the homeless issue. There is the prevention piece, and then there's the production. We need to be producing housing. So there's really three legs to this. There's prevention of homelessness, there's homeless services once someone is experiencing homelessness, and then where do we put people? We need to be putting people into housing, that third piece, and how do we have accountability around production of housing? So one of the things that I'm working on with a committee called the Greater LA Committee is this report called the No Going Back Report. And we want to use this crisis as an opportunity to potentially address some of the broken areas of our housing and homeless system, so that when we come out of this economic challenge, that we are actually better off, and that we have put in place systems of accountability to really hold the region accountable for this issue. Because as the mayor was describing, you have to have regional solutions, because it absolutely is a problem that doesn't experience, borders, and it doesn't rest with one jurisdiction. And so that's some of the work that we're trying to lift up through this report, and the committee that I'm working on. And we have some philanthropic support through the Weingart Foundation. And we're trying to, in 2021, really lift up that accountability piece of how do we hold our region and our state accountable for these three important legs: prevention, homeless services, and production of both low, middle, and moderate income housing. So those are the things I'm working on. I'd love to hear more from you and engage in a dialogue of questions, concerns. And while we're talking, I'm going to try and put into the chat some of the articles and studies that I referred to so that you can go back to them and, if it's useful, because I think it's really important to lift up this information so that we're all holding each other, but particularly our state and federal officials accountable to make progress. And there really is a lot of hope on progress starting in January, but I think it's going to take all of us to make sure that happens.
This is Carmen. I have a couple of questions. I'm back on. My internet is kind of wobbly, so I really apologize. But I wanted to ask one of the questions is, what effect does homelessness have on women and women with children? And regardless of what age, I know that there are high school kids that are homeless along with their parents in and out of shelters. Is there any research done with regards to what effect that has on those children and their academic performance?
Absolutely. There's some fabulous, I'll try to put in the chat, there's some fabulous research on the health effects of people experiencing homelessness, and particular people, children who've experienced homelessness. The greatest indicator that you will be homeless as an adult is that you've experienced homelessness at some point as a child. And that is, shocking, and maybe it's predictable, but it's also quite sad. One of the things we're trying to do on the prevention side is be really smart with prevention dollars, and try to keep people in housing and to identify folks who are going to fall into homelessness. And one way we identify that is anyone who's previously experienced homelessness, and particularly experienced homelessness as a child, is incredibly likely to experience it again. And so that's where we're trying to do a better job of identifying folks and making sure they're connected to services. There's also all sorts of research on the health effects, all from a variety of points of view. So and that means that, quite honestly, that your lifespan is shortened. So people who have experienced long-term homelessness, their average lifespan is in their early 50s. And, as I'm sure you know, our average lifespan, people of housing security, is 30 years beyond that. So 30 plus years beyond that. So it really is a matter of life and death. You're talking about people who experience long-term homelessness, literally lose decades off of their life.
This is Carmen again. I have another question, and that is, we have a lot of mom and pop landlords. So this is kind of a even broader question and a broader picture, whose income is derived from this, small duplexes, etc. And many of them are seniors. What this moratorium, the rent moratorium, which has allowed their tenants not to pay rent, how is that affecting them? And is there any projections on possible foreclosures of those people and they themselves becoming homeless?
I don't think we have good projections in terms of they themselves becoming homeless. We do have a lot of projections around them losing their property, so and experiencing foreclosure. And so there is a great national study right now around, first and foremost, getting the word out that almost everyone, if you have a federally backed mortgage, is available, it is eligible for mortgage deferral, and they need to access that. There are actually millions of people who need to access mortgage deferral who aren't. And they need to access that, because if you don't raise your hand and say, hey, I need to get a mortgage deferrable, I'm being impacted by this crisis, you can be foreclosed upon. But if you have raised your hand and said, I need mortgage deferral, you cannot be foreclosed upon at this time under the current rules. Again, we still need to lift up the delay of foreclosure the same way we did during the economic crisis of the Great Recession. We need to defer mortgage foreclosures until we can better sort out this back rent issue. Most of the bills being discussed right now in the state legislature include both rent relief and some form of mortgage relief, particularly targeted toward mom and pop landlords. So there is some good news on the horizon. Again, as long as all of us are continuing to lift that up as a significant issue. We don't want to see mom and pop landlords lose their property because of the rent crisis that's going on right now. So when we talk about rent relief, we have to also lift up mortgage relief. And in particular in Los Angeles County, there are quite a few women-led households, communities of color, where, that rental property, which may be just a duplex and they're living in one and they're renting out the other half, is their income, is their retirement, is their livelihood. And so we have to lift that up as a very significant issue. And it's very different than the institutional investor issue. Institutional investors who own 20,000 units can write off $5,400. About 20% of the institutional investors' renters are not paying rent. That's 80% are. About 20% are not. There are ways and economic tax benefits and all sorts of other ways that they can write off that piece. And quite honestly, maybe not in public, but certainly in private, I've talked to institutional investors and they've been made clear that they can absorb that loss. Mom and pops cannot. A mom and pop cannot absorb that loss. And if you're in a duplex and that's, one unit is not paying rent, that's 50% of your income. It's not 20%. So we do have to continue to lift up mom and pop landlords in Los Angeles County and make sure they're at the forefront of relief, both in the state and federal packages.
Okay. Does anyone else have any other questions?
Carmen, I had a question.
Yes. Okay, Jan, and the Honorable Jan Perry.
Oh, thanks. And then it's good to see you, Sarah. I wanted to ask about Project Room Key.
Yeah.
And it seemed like such a good idea and so perfect for year-round continuous, housing. And I was wondering, why does it have to terminate? Why does it have to end?
It doesn't. And I've been lobbying and so Council President Martinez put in a motion to try and extend it. And I've been, lifting up the fact that it should be extended. There are quite a few, look, tourism's not coming back anytime soon, as you and I both know.
Mhm.
And quite honestly, for the 2-star hotel, that might 2 or 3-star hotel, that night might not be until 2024. And so there are a lot of opportunities right now with existing stock instead of building from scratch construction that we, have to do a better job of exploring. And just for everyone else on this call, Project Room Key is where we negotiate a long-term lease with a hotel owner. the leases have been pretty reasonable. So the price per night that we're paying on average in certain areas is, around $65 a night for the lease. Then on top of that, we do provide security and food and access to housing case management. So it is more expensive than just the lease alone. But in terms of the fact that, if in January of this year, if we had all said to each other, we're going to house 20% of our homeless, unsheltered population in a matter of 2 or 3 months, most folks would have laughed and said, there's absolutely no way you couldn't possibly accomplish that. That's what we did with Project Room Key. We went out and we said, hey, we have a room for you right over here. And folks just said, yes, heck yeah, let's go. And so we were able to bring in folks who were unsheltered extremely rapidly. My hope is that some form of the program continues. And it does mean that we do have to lift that up as a viable option. The state government paid about 25% of the cost. And the governor has just re-upped that one time for a few more months. And our hope is that we continue to push that they will continue to re-up that 25%. The other 75% has to be front funded by local funds, but is actually reimbursed by FEMA. But FEMA, I'm hopeful for some FEMA reform in the coming months, because FEMA does bring us back to the olden days of HUD that you might remember. They asked for 100% documentation of everything. So every request for a reimbursement that we send in is literally stacks and stacks of boxes, because they want 100% documentation of absolutely everything. So some local jurisdictions gave up on Project Room Key because they said, we can't manage, trying to get FEMA reimbursement. FEMA sure makes it hard to get any of their money. And we do have to lift that up as a huge issue, and that's got to change. But LAHSA's position is that this has been one of the most effective programs we've ever run. And we're hopeful to extend it as long as we can. And we want the federal government to continue to pay that 75% and to pay it in a more timely manner.
Okay.
Hi, Jen Britton here from Hermosa Beach. Thank you. This is all very informative. And I was on a Zoom meeting this week locally, and we are doing a lot in Hermosa, Manhattan, and Redondo to get some things going. I have kind of a bigger question. All this is good, but what do we do? I have some property in LA where you've got a homeless population that are basically not only destructive to the neighborhood, but each other. A lot of drug dealing and fires, and the police hands are somewhat tied because they have to arrest them and let them out, or unless they can prove they're danger to everybody else. But it's like, what energy can a community do, or what help can they get with this type of population? I know you talked about your brother, and we're aware that there are people that choose not to take housing, but it's and we've had problems with homeless advocates interfering with trying to help them. They want to leave them there rather than provide them help. So, I'm just concerned because they are getting more destructive to themselves. What help can we get, or what would you suggest?
Well, one thing I'm doing on that front is trying to lift up better research about the extreme adverse health effects of living in encampments. And so we're working with UCLA, and we're hopeful to publish a report soon on some of those extreme effects. One of which is, as I was just lifting up before, is that your lifespan is shortened, that you're going to live, decades less than you would if we could get you into housing. I do think, and having a lot of personal experience in this issue, a lot of folks who are saying no to housing, honestly, were not given access to the right intervention, or didn't have, a really great outreach worker. And in terms of your particular issue, I'm happy to give you my information, and we can just make sure that a really excellent service provider is working on that particular encampment. I know, we've certainly had challenges like that in the past. And when you put sort of the folks who are really have this as their expertise on the case, they can often make progress. More generally, case law is against moving people. And in particular, in this moment of the pandemic, it is really challenging because if you're offering someone to come into a shelter environment, there is the risk of contracting the virus. The Boise case that the mayor referred to would only allows to say, hey, you have to come inside if there is this direct offer of housing. And so that's being illuminated in the Alliance case before Judge Carter in LA County. And one of the goals of the city is to be able to offer and provide housing. So their goal is to create about 6,700 units by February, March, so that for all of the campments near and around freeways, that they can offer housing and therefore be able to move people out of living in an encampment and living in a housing environment. But that tension that we have between, trying to respect somebody's civil liberties and yet real concern over their life is a tension that has been around in California for some time. And I often feel that it's partly a tension because people are asking just the wrong question and not providing, not intervening with access to mental health care or access to sober living or access to substance abuse treatment. And I think my goal is to help better educate everybody so that we can demand services for all our residents and hopefully, save people's lives. The people in that encampment, long term, they're not going to live, beyond 50. And we have to just not tolerate that anymore. And have to demand the services that people need in order to get people into housing. So I see your info, and I'm going to write it down right now.
Great. Okay, thank you. That's very helpful.
Jackie, I see your hand is up.
Who?
Jackie Hawthorne, is your hand up?
Oh, yes. Thank you very much for recognizing me, Madam Chair, Madam President. Good morning, Sarah. I would like to bring to your attention, Sarah, as well as to the other ladies and gentlemen on this call, that my guest, Professor Martina Ramirez, has put some very interesting information into the chat. One is an app to help homeless youth, and she's a professor at Loyola Marymount College, and a class that they will be having, the ecology of homelessness. Martina, do you want to just very quickly say a couple of words?
Sure. Hello, everyone. So one of my colleagues in the Department of Health and Human Sciences.
Speak up, dear.
Oh, okay. One of my colleagues in the Department of Health and Human Sciences studies homelessness, which is where the course developed and where these other things in the chat arose from. The student profiled is a student who was involved in the course, who went off on her own and developed this app. Something else I'll find is some computer science students helped a homeless nonprofit apparently develop some database management stuff, kind of to help their operations and things like that. And I'll put that in the chat too as well. The other thing is I also put symposium program so we have something here called the Center for Reconciliation and Justice, and I'm on their board of directors, okay? So every year they take a theme, and one of the themes, as you'll see from 2019, was basically living on the margins in LA. So homelessness was a big feature of that. And then notice there are links to a number of speakers and presentations that were presented at that symposium. So there's a lot of interest around campus in this topic, right? And so I'm giving you a selection of what goes on here about that stuff. So hope that helps.
Marvelous. Thank you so much, Martina.
And Councilwoman Perry, let me see if I can unmute you for some strange reason.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to review it. Have
Do a question, Sarah. There is so much around this whole issue of homelessness and its effect on various populations. And
Councilwoman Perry, did you have a question?
and the work that we're doing to look at it. Rent subsidy. So what I was describing, that is what Congresswoman Waters has been lifting up in her bill. 1 in 8 people in LA are eligible for federal vouchers, but don't get them. And because of that, because of the 7 out of the 8 people who don't get them, a lot of the projects that we're financing and things that we're working on, we don't have federal subsidy for. So it doesn't, the money goes a lot faster. If we did have that federal subsidy, we'd be able to take a little bit of our local dollars and spread it a lot further. So that's one of the problems. The other problem is that building affordable housing is expensive because building housing is expensive. If I were going to build any kind of housing, I would be looking at, per door in the city of LA, $70,000 per door before I'd ever actually built anything, before I'd even put a piece of wood, and a nail together, because of various fees and other costs that we have put on housing. So we do have to look at streamlining. And I lift up, I'm currently utilizing Assemblymember Santiago's bill, SB 1197, which provided us a CEQA exemption, or a California Environmental Quality Act exemption, for the construction of low-income housing. And so some housing that I'm working on right now with Supervisor Solis is going to be about $150,000 per door. We started construction in October. It's going to open in February, March. So it's modular construction, and the cost is substantially less. But we eliminated what's called the holding costs. And a lot of you who have experience in real estate know, when I say it costs $70,000 per door before you even started construction, that's because you've been holding on to the land. In addition to fees and other things you're paying, you're holding on to this piece of land while you're waiting to get permits and approvals. And so if we eliminate some of those hurdles, either through CEQA exemptions or through other streamlining efforts, you can substantially lower the cost. So in this particular project I'm working on, there's no cost to hold the land because it's going to be built within 6 months. And eliminating that cost takes $70,000 per door off the top of the cost of the project.
Wow.
So that's those types of reforms are what we need to get to lower costs across the board, so that we can construct housing more quickly and in a less expensive manner. But I do want to make sure, yes, we've spent a lot of money, and yes, there's a lot of local investment, but in large part, it pales into comparison to the federal disinvestment. So it looks like we're spending so much money, but in part, it's because somebody emptied our bank account before we started. So I do want to make sure that I bust that myth a little and that people understand, yes, it's a lot of money, but in part it's a lot of money because the federal government, prior to us passing Measure H, cut our funding by 76%. And so again, 1 in 8 people locally get the federal money that they need. And nationally, that's 1 in 4. And that stat alone means that we have to use local dollars or state dollars to fill that gap. So if we could really get some real national housing reform done in the next 6 months, which is certainly a lot of our greatest hopes, we could really chip away at that huge disadvantage because we're spending a ton of money, but it's all local dollars. We are not getting the federal investment that we need.
Would you define that gap again? It's the gap between the area what?
You mean the area median income gap or the gap?
Uh-huh.
The 1 in 8 gap is, so when I say 1 in 8, I mean, if I had 8 families in front of me,
Mhm.
only one of them will have a federal voucher for rent subsidy. So I'll be able to house that family. Now, all 8 of them are in poverty, eligible for that voucher, have, have everything, they've done everything right. This is back where I just get frustrated. Like, I've got a lot of families, they've done everything right. They did what they were supposed to do. They're trying to do right by their children. They've done everything right. 7 of those families have no voucher. 1 family has a voucher.
Okay, this is Carmen. Can we recognize Petra Dieter, Dr. Dieter?
Hi, everyone. Sorry. Yeah. No, continue, please.
Go ahead. Petra, did you have a question? Because you had your hand up.
Oh, yes, I do. But I don't know if Sarah finished. Like, did you finish?
No, sure. That's it. I explained the gap, and I'm happy to put, I'll put into the chat a little bit more about that.
Just one more question. When you say voucher, are you talking the Section 8 vouchers?
Yes. I mean, the housing choice voucher.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Petra, can we continue? Petra?
No, go ahead. But why are we at that gap from 1/4 as opposed to 1/8? Like, why are we different than the rest of the country?
Well, in part because over the last couple of years, the federal government wanted to spread more vouchers in Republican-led jurisdictions and swing states. So when they issued additional rounds of vouchers, for example, in the last round, none were given to LA County.
Orange County, yes, right? Arun,
yeah.
Bhumitra, you
So
have a
that's
question?
part of the gap was a politically motivated choice.
Mr. Bhumitra, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. My question is, with all what's going on, are there any intervention groups which can work with the families of the homeless? For example, I have a couple of small.
We lost you, Arun.
We lost you. We heard the part about you were looking for some intervention groups, and you said you had a couple of families.
You're frozen.
You're frozen, Arun. Okay.
Did you
I
get
still
enough?
have
All right.
another question, if that's okay.
Jan,
I was just
do you
gonna
have
say,
a question? You have a hand?
no,
up?
you had enough of Arun's question to try to answer what you think he wanted to ask.
Well, if he's asking about prevention efforts, I don't know which part of the county he's in, but the answer is yes. So we have several grants going right now with Neighborhood Legal Services and Inner City Law Center to prevent people from becoming homeless. And I'm happy to put into the chat the contact information. I actually have a great flyer that covers the whole county with direct information, depending on what region you're in, and access to rent relief and and legal services to try and keep people in housing.
We have we have time for one more question. Does anybody have another question?
I do, if that's okay.
Okay, Dr. Gator, yes.
Yeah, so you started to talk about the cost of housing and trying to get around getting a special exemption to get the permit to build the house. I think one of the big problem with the building costs is the building code around here. Like in other countries, for example, they are a little bit more relaxed in building codes, which I understand in terms of the standard of living and safety and that kind of things. But if there's a way of getting a special exemption for low-income housing, especially like, for example, the idea of what do you call tiny homes or things like that, where, you know, low-income housing can be built really effectively and really fast and really inexpensively, then we could have resolved a lot of this problem much quicker. But is there a way of going to that? You know, because a lot of it's like permit costs and then the requirement of building really large home and the requirement of, you know, the minimum size and that kind of things.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. And so we're doing a lot of work around incentivizing or streamlining what are called units. And whether it's a micro unit that is available as an ADU or accessory dwelling unit, or a micro unit that's added on at scale to, you know, a larger project. But you're absolutely right. You know, 100 years ago, there were tens of thousands of micro units. They weren't cool and hip. They were in, you know, downtown Los Angeles. And Councilmember Perry, who's, you know, on this call, led the effort to try and preserve some of those units, but a lot of them were lost. And it's not just that they were lost, we stopped building them. We disincentivized, or actually in some cases banned, building units that were around, you know, 300 square feet. There's no reason that we can't revisit that. And, you know, the project that I'm working on for Supervisor Solis right now in downtown Los Angeles, the units are around 200 square feet, which, you know, it's not fabulous, but in New York City, it would be a nice studio. Let's just be honest. And so we need to really revisit how we think about housing. And that goes back to the myth busting. You don't need, you know, 1,200 square feet for a studio, and every square foot costs money. It depending on where and what's in the square footage, you know, it could be $250 to $450 per square foot to build new construction. And, you know, if it's a high rise, it's way more. I'm just talking about basic stick construction, 3 stories or less. And that means that every square foot matters. And so would I rather live in 300 square feet than in an encampment? I'm going to pick 300 square feet. So we have to start getting more creative. And there's a lot of cool new designs that are coming online through different advocacy groups called fast housing options. And, you know, our hope is that we spur that kind of design and interest to create new construction models, because they're not only cheaper, but they can be built faster. And they're really quite beautiful. Really, really quite beautiful.
I believe our time is up. Thank you so much, Sarah Dusseault. We can certainly see that she was deputy mayor for the mayor of Los Angeles. You can see that she was, you know, has been in the homelessness as an advocate, as a commissioner, and in redesign of cities, as we can see what downtown Los Angeles looks like as the way it looked like in 1995. So thank you very much. I also wanted to acknowledge two other people that came in, Dee Perry from the Laguna Beach School District and Maria Calix, who is a commissioner on the Los Angeles Women's Commission. She's vice president of Los Angeles Women's Commission. And of course, the Honorable Jan Perry, councilwoman from the city of Los Angeles. I just want to say thank you very much to everybody. These little intimate conversations are very important. These are women's issues, and it's going to take all of us to being able to make things better for the entire community. So, Sarah, thank you very much for all you do, your passion, your work, your training as an attorney. By the way, she is a graduate of Yale and also UCLA Law School. I didn't get a chance to introduce you. But I think it
Go
shows.
Bruins.
Yeah.
I think it shows, all right. And her advocacy is significant in the city. And all these women that you've had a chance to meet here, Sarah, I'm hoping that you will be able to connect with them because they're all leaders in the community. We have some film people here. We have some other people here, not just political people, teachers, in the education community. And so therefore, in other words, it takes all kinds of cooks to make a fabulous meal. And so here we are,
Yeah.
creating the banquet. So thank you. Sarah, can you, if you can email me some of those docs, then
Yeah,
I
I
will
put
get
them in the
out.
chat, but I'll email you.
Yeah, and I will get them out to the people that participated in the call. And
Great.
so that way we can have that. And maybe Martina can do that also, so that we can have this, so that we can share some of the information. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thanks so much. Really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Carmen.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you, Carmen, and thank you all my friends who attended.
Okay.
Thank you, Miss
Bye.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.